The air in Okinawa in late June 1945 was not air. It was a thick, wet blanket woven from pulverized coral, the stench of death, salt, and human misery. The monsoon rains had turned the landscape into a slurry of mud and ash. This was not a battlefield. This was an aftermath. This is the story of a war after the war. It is not a story of grand strategy, of admirals or generals moving fleets. It is a story of the microscopic, agonizing collision of systems, a psychological autopsy of a moment in time when two irreconcilable narratives clashed in the mud, and the stakes were not territory, but the very definition of what it means to be human. This is Private First Class Jack Brooklyn O'Malley. He is 19 years old. He landed at Higuchi Beach weeks ago, his mind filled with the celluloid heroism of John Wayne. Now, that fiction is gone. Burned away, he thinks of nothing but a dry pair of socks and a world that doesn't smell like decay. The battle for Okinawa was officially over. General Roy Geiger, having taken command of the 10th Army after General Buckner's death, had declared victory. But for O'Malley, victory looked a lot like hell, just with more paperwork. His M1 rifle felt heavier each day, less a tool of war and more a glorified stick to herd the dazed, skeletal figures that shuffled into the civilian internment camp at Tengan by the thousand. O'Malley stood at the wire, looking in. The stockade was a sea of gray, ragged kimonos and patched-together rags. The sound was a constant, low-level symphony of grief, hunger, and a terror so profound it had become atmospheric. This terror was the product of a deliberate, calculated psychological campaign. The United States was engaged in a war of information. Its leaflets promised humane treatment, food, and safety. This was not entirely altruistic. It was strategic. With the invasion of mainland Japan, Operation Downfall, looming, the High Command, Nimitz, Truman, needed to prove that surrender was not annihilation. They needed to break the Japanese no-surrender code, or the invasion would cost 1 million American lives. The Imperial Japanese Army was engaged in its own war of information. Its narrative was simple and absolute. The blue-eyed devils were subhuman. They were lazy, decadent, and barbaric. They would rape. They would butcher. They would show no mercy. For the civilians of Okinawa, this propaganda was not a suggestion. It was a military order. PFC O'Malley had seen the tragic, successful results of that propaganda on the cliffs of Mabuni. He had seen the bodies of entire families, of mothers who had thrown their children onto the rocks below before leaping to their own deaths. He was now guarding the survivors, the ones who had, for whatever reason, failed to die. His eyes fell on a new arrival being shoved forward in a processing line. She was perhaps his own age. Her name, though he would not know it for weeks, was Hanako Tanaka. She was not a soldier. She was a student from Shuri, whose world had evaporated in a cloud of naval gunfire and flamethrowers. She clutched a small, tightly wrapped bundle to her chest, as if it were the last anchor in a drowning world. Her eyes scanned the American guards. She was reciting a Buddhist prayer her grandmother had taught her, her lips barely moving. Shiki, soku, ze, ku. Ku soku ze shiki. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. But the fear was not empty. It was solid. It was choking her. PFC O'Malley watched her. He saw the way she protected that small bundle. He'd seen GIs do the same with letters from home, or a Zippo lighter from a dead buddy. The thought was a small, uncomfortable spark in his exhausted mind. This is the central axis of our story. a 19-year-old American soldier raised on a narrative of heroic violence, and a 22-year-old Okinawan student raised on a narrative of divine sacrifice and demonic enemies. They are separated by 50 yards of mud, by language, by culture, and by a total war that is actively trying to annihilate both their worlds. What happens when the systems they represent, the U.S., military's strategic policy of humane processing, and the Japanese military's policy of death before dishonor, collide in the space between these two individuals? Inside the camp's medical tent, Nurse Clara Goldstein, a U.S. Army nurse from Minnesota, was fighting a different war. A war against dysentery, typhus, and septicemia. She slammed down a metal clipboard. "We need more lye. We need more DDT. We need more everything." She snapped at a young corpsman, who wisely nodded and vanished. Clara's war was one of logistics and brutal medical necessity. From her diary, a small, sweat-stained ledger, her handwriting sharp with anger and fatigue. June 26, 1945. Tengan Stockade. We are now responsible for over 15,000 civilians in this sector alone. Admiral Nimitz may be planning the invasion of the mainland, but here on the ground, we are drowning in a humanitarian crisis he cannot imagine. The women and children, they are covered in lice, head lice, body lice. It's a typhus explosion waiting to happen. The order came down from command this morning. Mandatory dousing. We have to shave their heads. Every last one. They will see it as a violation. Another act of barbarism from us. But how do you explain sanitation to someone who believes you are a monster? Here, the moral calculus of occupation becomes painfully clear. From the American command's perspective, this was a life-saving measure. Typhus, carried by lice, could kill thousands. It would not only wipe out the civilian population, but also infect the American troops. The order to shave heads was, in their view, a fundamentally humane act. But to Hanako Tanaka, it was the final, horrifying confirmation of the propaganda. The processing line moved. Hanako was directed towards a large tent, the sanitation tent. A group of corpsmen and nurses stood outside holding clippers and buckets. A low, terrified wail erupted from the women being pushed inside. Hanako saw the shears. She saw a pile of black hair on the muddy ground. The women ahead of her were being held down, their beautiful long hair shorn off in rough, quick strokes. We must pause to understand the cultural trauma of this moment. This was not a haircut. In her culture, a woman's long black hair was her pride, a profound symbol of her identity and femininity. To have it taken this way, by these giant, hairy foreign men, was a violation worse than being naked. It was a symbolic defilement, a stripping of her very personhood. She clutched her small bundle, the last photo of her family, a few grains of rice in a silk pouch, and a small, sharp piece of shrapnel she had picked up near her ruined home. A token of the world that had ended. O'Malley turned back, drawn by a new pitch in the crying. He saw Hanako resisting, not with strength, but with a desperate, frozen stillness. A burly corpsman, a man named Steiner, with thick forearms and an expression of profound boredom, grabbed her arm. For Steiner, this was not a human interaction. This was a task. He was a vector control specialist. He did not see a woman. He saw a carrier for lice. He saw Task 14B, delousing. He grabbed Hanako's shoulder. She flinched, her body going rigid, but she did not scream. Her terror was a vacuum, sucking all sound inward. PFC O'Malley watched, his knuckles white on the stock of his M1. He was rooted to the spot by a complex paralysis, military discipline, profound awkwardness, and a sickening sense of participation. He was the zookeeper, watching the handlers shear the animals. "Hold still, sister," Steiner muttered. He grabbed her hair, a thick black cascade that fell to her waist, oily and matted from weeks in hiding. He wrapped his hand in it and pulled her head back. Hanako's eyes squeezed shut. The steel of the clippers was cold against her scalp. It was not a precise or gentle tool. It was a sheep shear, powered by a coughing generator. The sound was a low mechanical growl, and then the zip as the teeth bit. O'Malley looked away, his stomach turning. He heard the metallic snick-snick of hand shears finishing the job. When he looked back, it was done. Hanako was on her knees. Her head, now stubbled and pale, was exposed to the humid air. She looked alien, a child, a skull. Tears streamed silently down her face, cutting clean paths through the grime. She was not crying from the loss of her hair. She was crying because the last piece of her identity had been taken by a machine. She was no longer Hanako Tanaka, the student from Shuri. She was a number, a shaved head, a Horyo, a prisoner. The corpsman roughly dusted her head with white DDT powder, the cloud making her cough. He shoved her toward the next station. As she stumbled, the small, precious bundle she had clutched to her chest fell from her grasp, spilling its contents into the filth. A folded photograph, a few grains of dark rice, and the small, jagged piece of shrapnel. Hanako let out a small, strangled gasp and lunged for it, but Steiner kicked it away. "No contraband. Move along." "Hey." O'Malley's voice was a croak. He hadn't meant to speak. Steiner turned, annoyed. "What, Brooklyn?" O'Malley walked forward, breaking protocol. He felt the eyes of the other guards on him. He bent down and picked up the items, his gloves smearing mud on the photograph. He saw the faces of a smiling older couple and a younger boy. He scooped up the piece of metal, sharp enough to cut. He looked at Steiner. "It's just junk. Let her have her junk." He stepped in front of Hanako, who cowered, expecting a blow. He pushed the items, mud and all, back into her hands. He was clumsy. His hands were too big, his movements too stark. He couldn't meet her eyes. He just muttered, "Go on, Ike." Hanako stared at his gloved hand, then at his face. He was not a blue-eyed devil. He was something else, confusing. She snatched the items and fled into the teeming mass of the stockade. O'Malley went back to his post, his heart hammering, feeling the heat of Steiner's glare. This was the first knot, the first connection. The system, in the form of Steiner, had stripped her of her identity. An individual, in the form of O'Malley, had broken from that system to restore a small piece of it. A critical, unseen line had been crossed. Days bled into a week. The routine of the camp became a grim, monotonous rhythm. O'Malley's patrols became a strange, silent dance. He found himself, perhaps unconsciously, timing his rounds to pass the section of the camp where Hanako had settled with a small group of other women. He never spoke to her. He just watched. He saw her share her meager ration with an older woman. He saw her meticulously cleaning the mud off the photograph he had retrieved. He started leaving things. A stray can of peaches, fallen from a crate near the wire. A bar of soap. He told himself it was just basic decency, an anonymous act. But he knew it was something more. It was an apology. It was an attempt to scrub the image of the clippers from his mind. One evening, The air was thick and still. O'Malley was on a late patrol. The camp was quiet. "Soldier San." The voice was a whisper, barely audible. He froze, spinning, his M1 coming up halfway. Hanako was there, half hidden by a canvas flap. Her face was pale in the moonlight, her shorn hair giving her the look of a frightened boy. She looked terrified, of him, and of what she was about to do. "You?" "No," O'Malley whispered, motioning for her to get back. Contact was forbidden. A GI seen talking to a prisoner, especially a female one, would be on a barge to the stockade himself. This was the ultimate taboo. She stepped out. Her eyes were wide, fever bright. She was holding her side, and her breath came in shallow, pained gasps. "No, dame, go back," O'Malley hissed. She shook her head, a violent, desperate motion. She took a stumbling step closer. The cultural barrier was a 1,000-foot wall. She, a proper Japanese woman, was approaching an enemy male, alone, in the dark. He, an American soldier, was alone with an enemy prisoner. Every instinct in his training screamed, "Danger!" She spoke, her voice shaking, using the few English words she had been forced to learn. "Please." She held up one hand, a gesture of peace. With the other, she pointed to her own abdomen, just below her ribs. "Please, touch. Here." O'Malley's blood ran cold. The request was so bizarre, so loaded, so impossible, it stopped his thoughts. His mind, conditioned by the crude jokes of the barracks and the ever-present fear of fraternization, flashed to a dozen horrifying interpretations. Was this a trick? A test? A desperate, insane plea? In a world where all touch had been violence, what did this desperate plea truly mean? "What?" he said, his voice hard with confusion. Hanako winced, a tear of pure agony leaking from her eye. She saw his frozen, hostile confusion. She thought he didn't understand. Desperate, she reached out and grabbed his hand, the one not holding the rifle. Her hand was burning hot. She tried to pull his hand to her own stomach, forcing his fingers onto the spot. "Here," she gasped. "Please. Itai." Pain. O'Malley felt it then. Through the thin, ragged cotton of her shift, his fingers brushed against something that shouldn't be there. It wasn't soft flesh. It was a hard, agonizingly tight mass beneath her skin. It was hot, like a coal. He ripped his hand back as if he'd been burned. He finally understood. This wasn't a solicitation. This wasn't a plea for comfort. This was a medical emergency. He looked at her face, now gray with pain, and saw the truth. The piece of shrapnel he'd picked up from the mud wasn't her only souvenir from the battle. She had another one, and it was still inside her. "Clara!" he roared, spinning towards the medical tent. "Goldstein, get out here! Now!" Clara Goldstein burst out of the tent, a .45 pistol on her hip. "O'Malley, what in God's name?" She stopped. O'Malley was no longer a guard. He was a terrified 19-year-old, his M1 hanging uselessly. He just pointed at the girl, now slumped against him, barely conscious. "She's sick, ma'am, real sick. She showed me. Here." Clara's fury evaporated, replaced by the cold, efficient mask of a triage nurse. She knelt in the mud, ignoring the forbidden contact. "Courtmen!" she yelled. "Stretcher, now!" She ran her practiced, gentle fingers over Hanako's abdomen. Hanako cried out, a thin, weak sound. Rigid, hot, distended. Clara looked up at O'Malley. "How long has she been like this?" I don't know. I just saw her." "Well, you just bought yourself a job, PFC. Help me get her inside." As they carried her, Other prisoners watched from the shadows of their hovels. They weren't seeing a rescue. They were seeing an abduction. A whisper passed through the shadows. She was being taken to be punished for speaking to the guard. They placed her on a cot in the surgery section, separated from the dysentery ward by a hanging blanket. The air was thick with carbolic acid, kerosene, and a faint, sweet, rotting odor that Clara called the enemy. Hanako was delirious, chanting in Japanese. Clara ripped open her kimono. The sight underneath made O'Malley recoil. The hard mass was a grotesque, purplish swelling. In the center was a tiny, puckered hole oozing a thin, dark fluid. It was a puncture wound, weeks old, and it was septic. "My God," Clara breathed. "O'Malley, hold her shoulders. She's going to fight." "What? What is it?" "It's shrapnel. A fragment. It's been in there since the shelling. It's walled off, but it's abscessed. She's dying, O'Malley. Right now. From the inside out." Clara probed the wound. Hanako screamed, a raw animal sound, her body arching off the cot. O'Malley grabbed her, his hands clumsy on her small, bony shoulders. "It's okay. It's okay," he whispered, the words meaningless. She was a furnace, burning with fever. "I have to open it," Clara said, her voice flat. "I have to drain the poison and get that metal out." She looked at her instrument tray. A few scalpels and alcohol, some sutures, a bottle of ether. "This is going to be a butcher shop." She turned to O'Malley. "Hold her. Don't let her move." You're doing it? Here? Now." "In 10 minutes, she'll be in septic shock. In an hour, she'll be dead. You got a better idea?" Clara soaked a wad of gauze with ether and placed it in a cone. As she brought it toward Hanako's face, Hanako's eyes flew open. She saw the American nurse, the demon, bringing a mask to her face. She saw the soldier, the one who had retrieved her photo, holding her down. She screamed. She thrashed with a sudden, violent strength, her small hands clawing at O'Malley's arms. Korosareru! No, I'll be killed." "Hold her, damn it!" Clara yelled, pressing the mask down. "I'm trying," O'Malley yelled back, his heart shattering. He was pinning down a terrified woman while she was being suffocated. He looked down at Hanako's face, inches from his, her eyes wide with a pure, primal terror of him. This was the moment she'd been warned about. The monster was finally showing his true face. "Hanako-san," he said, his voice cracking. "It's okay. Daijobu. Medical. Nurse. Doctor." He used the few words he knew, fragments of a hopeless bridge. The fight went out of her as the ether took hold. Clara worked fast, her hands a blur. She sliced into the swollen, dark flesh. The smell hit O'Malley like a physical blow, a wave of putrescence so foul he gagged and turned his head. Clara didn't flinch. "Sponge! Now!" She was shoulder deep in the wound. It's deep, right up against the peritoneum. If it perforated, God, she's lucky. Or was. She grunted, probing. "There, I've got it." There was a wet, grating click. Clara pulled, and with a sickening pop, she extracted a 2-inch, jagged triangle of black, pitted steel. She dropped it into a metal kidney dish, where it clanged. "There's your devil," she said, breathing heavily. She immediately began irrigating the wound, then packing it with sulfa powder. "She's not out of the woods. This infection is systemic. She needs penicillin, a lot of it." She looked at her supply cabinet. "And I have exactly 1 ampule left. It's reserved for Captain Davies." O'Malley looked at the fragment in the dish. It was instantly recognizable. It wasn't the thin, tiny metal of a Japanese grenade. It was thick, beveled, high-grade American steel, part of a 5-inch shell from a U.S. destroyer. His side had done this. She needs the medicine, O'Malley said, his voice low. I know, Clara snapped, but I can't. My orders from General Geiger's staff are clear. U.S. personnel first. I give this girl the captain's penicillin, and he gets pneumonia. I'm court-martialed, and he's dead. So, you're just going to let her die? After this? I don't let anyone do anything, PFC, she shot back. I'm just one woman with a box of Band-Aids fighting a war. I don't have the supply. It's locked in the main depot, and it's guarded like the gold at Fort Knox. O'Malley stared at the piece of shrapnel. It was their shell. His shell. He had held her down. He had been the monster. He looked at Clara, then at the sleeping girl. Her face a pale, waxy yellow. He picked up the bloody kidney dish. You said the main depot? Clara's eyes widened. O'Malley, don't. That's Specialist Miller over there. He counts every single pill. You'll be caught before you get 10 feet. Specialist Miller owes me, O'Malley said, his voice a flat, cold tone she'd never heard. He lost $50 to me in poker last week. He tucked the dish with the shrapnel under his arm. What are you doing with that? A souvenir, he said, walking to the tent flap. To remind Miller who's paying for the medicine. He slipped out into the pre-dawn dark. He was no longer just a guard. He was a conspirator. He was a thief. And as he passed the command tent, he saw a shadow in the window. Captain Davies, his CO, was awake, and he was watching. The night was a void, the air saturated with the humid chill that comes before dawn. PFC O'Malley moved through the camp not as a patrol, but as a ghost. He was committing a capital crime, stealing U.S. Army property, the most valuable property on the island, to give to an enemy. He reached the supply depot. Specialist Miller, a pale man from Ohio, was doing inventory by lantern light. Miller, O'Malley said. Miller yelped. Brooklyn, you scared the life out of me. What do you want? It's 0400. I'm calling in that poker debt. Miller laughed nervously. You want smokes? A can of peaches? Come on, Jack. I'm busy. O'Malley opened his hand. He didn't show the ampule he wanted. He showed the kidney dish. Resting in the congealed dark fluid was the 2-inch piece of American shrapnel. Miller's smile vanished. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, what the hell is that? It's from a girl. A civilian, O'Malley said. Clara Goldstein just dug it out of her. It's septic. She's dying. So? They're all dying, Miller said, but his eyes were fixed on the bloody steel. This one's not, O'Malley said. She needs penicillin. 1 shot. I know you've got the reserve for the command staff. Miller's face went from pale to chalk white. Are you insane? That's not medicine, Brooklyn. That's a controlled asset. It's Captain Davies's personal reserve. It's for General Geiger if he visits. It's not for them. I sign for every single unit. If I give that to you, we're both in the stockade at Leavenworth before the week is out. Aiding the enemy. Treason. It's ours, O'Malley hissed, shoving the dish closer. Miller flinched. Look at it. It's a U.S. Navy shell fragment. We put it in her. Are we just going to let her rot from it? This was the moral calculus, the unwritten equation. Miller was a man of ledgers, of numbers and manifests, but this was an equation he couldn't solve. When does a human life start to outweigh a military order? Jack, I can't, Miller whispered, tormented. You owe me $50, O'Malley said, his voice soft. This is the $50. Just look the other way. He saw the keys on Miller's desk, the medical lockbox. Before Miller could protest, O'Malley brushed past him, unlocked the box, and his hand found the small, cold ampule. He took one. "You were never here," Miller said to his back, his voice shaking. "I never saw you. Your debt is paid, Brooklyn. Now get the hell out." O'Malley ran. He didn't walk. He ran, his boots sucking at the mud, the tiny glass vial a sun in his fist. He passed the command tent. The flap was open. Captain Davies, holding a tin mug, watching him. Davies didn't move. He didn't shout. He just watched O'Malley run from the supply depot and to the medical tent. The silence was louder than an accusation. He burst back into the medical tent. Hanako was convulsing, a thin, rattling foam on her lips. Clara was bathing her head, her face a mask of grim defeat. "She's crashing. The septicemia is in her brain. We're losing her." O'Malley grabbed her arm. He shoved the ampule into her hand. "You're not." Clara looked at the vial, her eyes wide with terror and awe. "How, Jack? Where did you—" "Just use it," he yelled. "Just use it. Now." Clara became a machine. This was her moral event horizon. She was a nurse. She had medicine. She had a patient. The rest was just noise. She snapped the ampule, drew the precious pale gold liquid into a syringe, and found a vein in Hanako's thin arm. She pushed the plunger, sending the life's work of Alexander Fleming into the bloodstream of an enemy girl on a forgotten island. The tent was silent. The rattling in Hanako's chest eased. Clara put her fingers on Hanako's neck. "It's in," she whispered, her hands shaking. "Now we pray." She looked at Jack. "And you, PFC O'Malley, had better start praying for yourself. You know Captain Davies was watching you." The tent flap was ripped open. Captain Davies stood there. He wasn't enraged. He was calm, which was infinitely more terrifying. His eyes took in the scene. Clara, the syringe still in her hand, O'Malley, standing guilty sentinel, and Hanako, now sweating profusely, the fever beginning to break. His gaze fell on the metal tray. He saw the empty ampule. Next to it, he saw the jagged piece of American shrapnel. "PFC O'Malley," Davies said, his voice a quiet rumble. "Sir!" O'Malley snapped to attention. Davies walked slowly into the tent. He looked at the girl. Then he looked at Nurse Goldstein. "Nurse," he said, "I've developed a rather persistent cough. I believe I was scheduled for a dose of penicillin this morning." Clara's blood ran cold. "Sir, there was an emergency, a critical patient." "I see that," Davies said, his eyes flicking to Hanako. He walked to the tray. He picked up the piece of shrapnel, weighed it in his hand, and looked at the U.S. Navy markings. "A complication." He set the metal down. He turned back to O'Malley. "I don't need the medicine, nurse," Davies said, rubbing the back of his neck. "My cough seems to have cleared up." O'Malley felt a rush of relief so profound his knees almost buckled. But the captain wasn't finished. "However," Davies said, his eyes locking on O'Malley, "Specialist Miller's inventory is now incorrect. A serious breach of protocol. And you, Private, were seen 50 yards off your patrol route in a restricted area, fraternizing with an internee." The relief vanished. This was a new, worse accusation. "You will report to my tent at 0600 O'Malley. In 1 hour," Davies said. "You will bring your M1, clean, and you will explain to me in detail what exactly you are doing playing savior to the enemy while we are still at war." He turned and left. Clara checked Hanako's pulse. A small, weak smile touched her lips. "It's strong. It's steady. The fever broke." She looked at Jack. "You saved her." O'Malley stared at the tent flap. He had won the battle for Hanako's life, but he had just walked into an entirely new war, and he was completely unarmed. The gray, humid light of 0600 filtered into Captain Davies's command tent. PFC O'Malley stood at rigid, terrified attention. His M1 rifle, which he had obsessively cleaned, held at his side. His uniform was still damp with Hanako's fever sweat. He smelled of mud, fear, and carbolic acid. Captain Davies was not at his desk. He was standing, looking at a map of Okinawa, a tin mug of coffee in his hand. The tent was silent, save for the drip of condensation. On the desk, between a field radio and a .45 pistol, sat the kidney dish. Inside it, the piece of American shrapnel. "You know the Uniform Code of Military Justice, Private?" Davies asked, not turning. "Sir, yes, sir." "You know the penalty for willful theft of medical supplies in a combat zone? For fraternization with an enemy internee? Which is what this is, O'Malley. Don't fool yourself." O'Malley's blood ran cold. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. Davies finally turned. He was a man in his 40s, with lines of exhaustion so deep they looked like scars. He wasn't angry. He was something far worse. He was calculating. "You think you're a hero, Private?" Davies asked, his voice quiet. "You think you just saved a life?" "No, sir. You just compromised my command," Davies said, stepping toward him. "You just put Nurse Goldstein in an impossible position. You just stole from your fellow soldiers. Specialist Miller is already under arrest." O'Malley's stomach dropped. "Sir, it was me. I forced him." "Quiet," Davies snapped. O'Malley snapped his jaw shut. Davies stared at him, a long, appraising look. "Do you have any idea what we are doing here? Do you think this is about winning a battle? The battle is over. This," he waved his hand at the camp beyond the tent flap, "is about winning the war. We are preparing for the invasion of the mainland. Operation Downfall. President Truman is demanding it. And Imperial General Headquarters is preparing to sacrifice every man, woman, and child to stop us. They believe we are devils." He walked to the desk and picked up the bloody piece of shrapnel. He held it in front of O'Malley's face. "This is a piece of a U.S. Navy 5-inch shell. Our propaganda tells them we are here to save them. Our shells tell them otherwise. That girl, Hanako Tanaka, if she had died of a septic, U.S.-made wound, after we had processed her, what do you think that story does? It spreads through this camp like typhus. It confirms every lie the Imperial Army told them. It's not one dead girl, O'Malley. It's 1,000 more civilians jumping off cliffs in Kyushu. It's 10,000 more GIs dead on a beach because the local populace would rather die than surrender to the butchers." O'Malley's mind struggled to grasp the scale of it. He hadn't been saving a girl. He had been intervening in a psychological operation. "You didn't follow the rules, Private," Davies said, his voice a low growl. "But you accidentally followed the mission. You stopped a rumor that could have cost me this entire camp. You proved our propaganda right." He tossed the shrapnel. It clattered back into the dish. "I can't have a thief in my supply chain," Davies said. "Specialist Miller's confession states he misplaced an ampule during a supply transfer. A tragic, punishable error. He'll be on latrine duty for a month." O'Malley blinked, processing the lie. Davies had just saved Miller. "And I can't have a guard who plays favorites," Davies continued. "You're off patrol. Effective immediately. You're reassigned. You will report to Nurse Goldstein. You are now her personal orderly. You will haul water. You will burn excrement. You will hold down the sick. And you will clean up the dead. You will not have a rifle. You will have a bucket. You will save all of them, O'Malley, not just the one who makes you feel good. Is that clear? Relief and shame washed over O'Malley in a disorienting wave. Sir, yes, sir. Get out of my sight. From the diary of Nurse Clara Goldstein, July 15th, 1945. The war has changed for me, and for PFC O'Malley. He's not a soldier anymore. He's my arms and legs. He's a pariah to the other GIs. They call him the Emperor's orderly, but he doesn't seem to care. He works 18 hours a day. He's learned to say, "It doesn't hurt" in Japanese. He's learned to see the human being behind the shaved head and the empty stare. The camp is still a nightmare of dysentery and malnutrition, but we're holding. We are holding. Hanako Tanaka is the miracle. She recovered. The penicillin, a literal gift from God and a court-martialed private, worked. She is a light. She's weak, but she started helping in the tent, translating, calming the other women, showing them how to eat the sea ration cheese. She and O'Malley, they have a language. It's not English. It's not Japanese. It's a language of silence, a nod, the passing of a clean bandage. He saved her life. Now, she is helping him save his soul. The final week of July was a hot, breathless purgatory. O'Malley, his uniform permanently stained, was emptying a waste bucket when he saw Hanako sitting outside the medical tent. Her hair had started to grow back, a soft, dark fuzz. She was thin, but her eyes were clear. She watched him. He stopped, awkward, holding the foul bucket. The cultural chasm was still there. He was a man. She, an unmarried woman. He, the enemy. She, the vanquished. He had held her down. He had saved her. Neither of them had the words for this complex, terrible, and beautiful thing. He nodded. "Ma'am." She nodded back. Then she did something that stopped him cold. She put her hand to her side, where the wound had been. Then she put her hand to his arm. Just for a second. A light, impossible touch. It was a reenactment. When she had gasped, "Please touch here," it was a plea born of an agony so profound it shattered all custom. It was the desperate cry of a human being in pain, reaching for any other human. Now she repeated the gesture. But this time, it was not a plea. It was a statement. "You touched this. You saved this." She bowed her head. "Arigato." O'Malley felt the knot in his chest, the one he'd carried since the Clippers, finally loosen. He just nodded, unable to speak, and carried the bucket away. The war ended a few weeks later. The mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki were just rumors, impossible stories that filtered into the camp. Then, the Emperor's voice on the radio. It was over. O'Malley was on a truck, being rotated out. The GIs were celebrating, shooting flares, drunk on the fact that they would not, after all, have to invade the mainland. The camp was in a state of stunned, silent chaos. He looked for her. He saw a small figure by the medical tent, watching the trucks leave. Hanako. Their eyes met across the yard. 100 yards of mud and history. He couldn't go to her. She couldn't come to him. She watched him, her face unreadable. Then slowly, she bowed. A deep, formal bow, not of submission, but of profound, equal respect. O'Malley, a 19-year-old kid from Brooklyn who'd seen the end of the world, felt his throat close. He raised a hand in a clumsy, awkward wave. As the truck rumbled out of the gate, he found a small, folded piece of rice paper in his pocket. A child must have slipped it to him. He opened it. It was a charcoal sketch, done with a burnt stick. It wasn't a portrait of him. It was a drawing of his hands, large and dirty, carefully picking her family photograph out of the mud. The first act, the moment the devil became a man. He clutched the paper, the only proof he had that any of it had meant anything, as the truck headed for the harbor, leaving the island of ash and silence behind.